The void was never truly silent. Even beyond the last whisper of stars, sound had a way of existing. The pulse of machine spirits, the hymn of reactor cores, the distant hum of unseen storms. For those who sailed the Immaterium, that hum became something else, a presence, a rhythm that echoed the heartbeat of the galaxy itself. And for the fleet known as Crusade Group Veritas, that heartbeat was about to stop. The fleet had entered the warp on the third cycle of the Arrestian campaign. They were a disciplined armada, forged from decades of service under the golden banner of Terra. At their head sailed a Retribution-class battleship, Imperial Wrath, a kilometer-long cathedral of steel, faith, and fury. Every corridor echoed with hymns. Every gun bore inscriptions of the Emperor's light. Around her sailed two lunar-class cruisers, Resolute Dawn and Magnan's Blade, and 4 squadrons of escorts whose machine spirits burned bright with the zeal of fresh anointment. Their mission was simple by the standards of the Imperium: reinforce a distant sector under threat from Tyranid incursions. Routine, dangerous, but expected. The kind of campaign that tested loyalty and faith more than tactics. Lord Admiral Helena Vortain had commanded fleets through worse. To her, the warp was no more than a tide to be mastered. Dangerous, yes, but predictable through discipline and prayer. Then came the storm. It began without ceremony. No flare of light, no thunderous warning. Just a subtle shift in the air of the navigator's sanctum, a faint vibration that turned into a bone-deep hum. The hololytic charts flickered. Warp currents changed color from deep crimson to pale violet, like bruised flesh. The navigator's third eye began to weep blood. He spoke one word before collapsing: moving. The Immaterium was moving. Outside the ship, the void rippled like water under a hurricane. The warp's currents twisted against each other, forming knots of pressure that bent light into spirals. The ship's Gellerfield, that holy barrier between mortal flesh and demonic hunger, shimmered under unseen strain. Tech priests recited the litany of reinforcement. Choirs chanted louder, but no sound could drown the low, crawling whisper that began to seep into every wall, every deck, every mind. Within minutes, the fleet's VoxNet became a storm of broken messages. One escort reported its navigation arrays spinning endlessly, pointing in all directions at once. Another transmitted screams before its signal cut to static. Even the mighty Imperial Wrath began to list slightly off its projected course, as though the warp itself had decided to tug it by invisible strings. Lord Admiral Helena Vortain stood on her command dais, unmoving. Around her, the bridge flickered with unstable light, half red from warning lumens, half gold from the glow of devotional icons. Officers recited status reports, their voices trembling as aspect screens warped into nonsense patterns. The Emperor's visage on the central shrine seemed to shimmer as if it were trying to look away. The storm had no beginning and no edge. One moment the void was calm, the next it was a living maelstrom of color and silence. Lightning without light arced across the fleet's flank, touching ships like the fingers of a god. Those touched were gone, erased from both sensor and memory. Crewmen blinked and swore the fleet had always been smaller. Records updated themselves to match the new count. Reality adjusted without protest. Inside the Imperial Wrath, the temperature dropped. Frost formed along the steel ribs of the bridge, even though the ship's reactors burned hotter than ever. The Admiral's command staff worked in rhythmic panic, maintaining rituals, reciting codes, sealing hatches that no one remembered opening. Time fractured in subtle ways. A single prayer seemed to take an hour. Orders given seconds ago were already carried out. The warp was no longer around them, it was inside them. The fleet's chaplain declared a full litany of endurance. His voice thundered through the Vox, a storm of faith against the madness. For a brief moment, the hum lessened. The crew found breath again. But when silence returned, it came with new whispers. Names, faces, promises. Some heard loved ones calling from beyond the veil. Others heard the Emperor himself or something pretending to be him. And then the Geller field flickered. It began as a brief pulse, barely noticeable, a heartbeat missed between breaths. But to the warp, it was blood in the water. The flicker became a stutter, then a shiver. Shadows appeared in corners where no light could fall. The air thickened like syrup. Crewmen reported movement in reflection panels, though none stood near them. The storm outside pulsed with colorless lightning, each flash illuminating silhouettes that defied description. The Mechanicus priests descended into fervent worship, chanting binary hymns to appease the machine spirit. Some opened their own veins to anoint the consoles. Others began removing their eyes, claiming they no longer needed them to see the Emperor's light. Within the navigator's chamber, the astropath choir screamed in unison and burned out their throats. One by one, their minds collapsed under psychic overload. What remained of them became an echo that refused to fade. For 3 subjective days, or 3 centuries depending on which chronometer you trusted, Crusade Group Veritas drifted blind through the living nightmare. No star maps, no reference points, only the writhing low of the storm that seemed to mock every attempt at orientation. The fleet's voxcasters looped fragmented messages from ships that no longer existed. Some transmissions carried their own voices, delayed by minutes or millennia. Others carried warnings from themselves, warnings that made no sense until after disaster struck. The warp had learned their pattern.
On the 4th cycle, a partial breach opened aboard Resolute Dawn. The Geller field in its aft quarter failed for exactly 47 seconds. That was long enough. When it came back online, half the ship's population was gone. The rest were found standing perfectly still, eyes open, whispering prayers in reverse. Tech priests examined the Vox records and found that the ship had been broadcasting the same distress signal repeatedly, but the timestamp placed it 3 hours in the future. The fleet tried to tighten formation. It only made things worse. Every attempt to realign the ships produced mirrored duplicates for fractions of seconds, ghost images that fired real munitions. Escorts collided with their own reflections, detonating in blinding silence. The Admiral ordered a dispersal maneuver, but the coordinates she gave were the same ones recorded an hour earlier. She had given the same order before. The storm was looping her voice. Then, without warning, Imperial Wrath's hololithic map displayed a new shape ahead. Vast, angular, and faintly human. It looked like another Imperial vessel. Its transponder identified it as Saint's Deliverance, a ship lost 2 centuries ago. Its beacon was steady, pure, broadcasting Imperial catechisms with perfect clarity. For the first time since the storm began, hope flickered. The Admiral ordered an approach. As the fleet neared, the hull appeared pristine. Gold trim, banners intact, guns idle. It radiated peace. But when the Imperial Wrath sent a Vox hail, the reply came in their own voices, identical tone, identical cadence, repeating their message before they had sent it. The reflection of the Imperial Wrath appeared across the Saint's Deliverance's hull, mimicking every motion. Then the reflection smiled. The warp tore open between them. Invisible claws dragged at reality, peeling layers of space like skin. The Saint's Deliverance convulsed, its hull twisting as if it were breathing. From its decks poured figures, thousands of them, not quite human, not quite demon. Each wore fragments of Imperial uniforms, their faces smooth and eyeless, mouths opening too wide. They moved with the precision of drilled soldiers. They were the fleet's own reflections, born of the storm's hunger. The Imperial Wrath fired first. Macro cannons roared, spitting tungsten shells glowing with plasma charge. Each shot carved a temporary void in the storm, a momentary hole in reality through which the Emperor's light seemed to shine. But every hole closed, and every explosion echoed back as laughter. The reflections advanced without ships, walking on the storm itself. Boarding torpedoes fired into nothing and returned full, carrying warped versions of the men who had launched them. The admiral ordered full sanctification of the decks. Incense poured through the ventilation systems. Servitors chanted binary prayers until their lungs burned. The ship became a shrine and a weapon at once. Every bolt shell was blessed. Every plasma conduit bore new sigils. The machine spirit of the Imperial wrath screamed its fury through the hull, a war cry heard by no one sane. And then silence. Just as suddenly as it began, the assault stopped. The phantom shapes vanished. The saint's deliverance was gone. Only debris remained. And even that shimmered before fading completely. The fleet floated again in eerie calm. Sensors showed empty void. But no one celebrated. Every officer who checked the chronometers found a different date. Some read decades ahead. Others showed centuries backward. Even the Emperor's name, engraved on the ship's bulkheads, now appeared slightly altered, as if someone had rewritten it in a forgotten dialect. Admiral Vortane retreated to her private sanctum. There, among relics of 100 victories, she stared at the flickering votive candles. Their flames bent sideways, whispering shapes that looked like prayers. She wrote in her command log, though the ink refused to dry, that the fleet would endure, that faith would be their shield, duty their compass, that the Emperor would not abandon his servants in the storm. But the warp had already learned her words. When she finished, the log displayed a final line she had not written. Faith sustains what the warp allows. Outside, the storm flared again. Warp lightning tore across the void, revealing shapes beyond comprehension. Cities made of screams, stars pulsing like eyes. The fleet drifted deeper, drawn towards a center that should not exist. And somewhere in the distance, the Imperial Wrath's voxcasters began transmitting a message on all frequencies, though no one had ordered it. The voice was calm, familiar, and endless. Hold the line. The Emperor endures.
The storm did not fade. It evolved. What began as a distortion of light became a labyrinth of false realities, each one folding upon the next like layers of a dying star. Time lost meaning. For those aboard the surviving ships, every second felt eternal. For some, days passed in the span of a breath. The warp did not kill them outright. It played with them, bending their perception until loyalty, fear, and faith became indistinguishable. On the bridge of the flagship Gloria Invictus, the hololithic displays showed nothing but flickering ghosts of data. The fleet's Vox network screamed endless static. Voices overlapped, each one claiming to be the true command signal. In truth, most were echoes, phantoms of orders that had never been given. Servitors spasmed at their consoles, their augmetics sparking as machine spirits rebelled. The captain, Lord Admiral Varen Holt, stood unmoving, staring into the void where the stars should have been. Instead, the storm stared back. The warp opened its mouth. 1,000 shapes drifted through the violet haze, fragmented visions of what might have been. Imperial cruisers burning in distant campaigns, the Emperor's face carved into worlds of gold, saints weeping blood. For Holt, each image was a needle driven into his faith. He had fought in countless void wars, but none of them had prepared him for this, a battle not against flesh, but against meaning itself. The Geller fields still burned around each ship, their golden glow flickering like candles in a hurricane. But they were failing, not because of power shortage or mechanical fault, because the warp remembered them. Each field pulsed with the psychic echo of its crew's fear, and the Immaterium fed on that fear as a predator feeds on blood. The protective barrier had become a feast. When the Gloria Victus drifted into a region of total silence, something vast moved beneath her. It was not a creature, but a shadow, a curvature in the storm itself. The ship's auspex arrays could not define it. It had mass, yet not shape, intent, yet not thought. When it passed, the warped flesh of reality tore open behind it, and from the rift came screams. Not daemons, not yet. These were reflections, psychic after-images of the crew's own memories. Thousands of figures appeared along the corridors. Children, lovers, comrades long dead. Some wept, others called names, all perfect in form, yet hollow behind the eyes. The warp's trickery was subtle at first, offering comfort before revelation. The moment any crewman reached to touch their apparition, the illusion melted into ash. Faith faltered. The fleet's astropaths tried to raise Terra, but the Astronomicon's light had vanished, consumed by the warp's opacity. Even the navigator of the Gloria Victus, entombed within his sealed sanctum, could not find a single stable corridor. His third eye bled, black ichor pouring down his face as he screamed the same phrase again and again. "We have left the galaxy." It was not true, yet neither was it false. The fleet was no longer entirely within real space or the Immaterium. They existed in the fold between, where concepts of location, distance, and causality dissolved. Hours became impossible to measure. Discipline, the Imperium's sacred currency, decayed. Ship by ship, men turned on one another, accusing officers of heresy, sabotage, or treachery. On one destroyer, the St. Helena, the chaplain executed the captain for praying too loudly. Another vessel, the Iron Devout, vented half its crew into space after an outbreak of warp contamination that no one could confirm. Madness had become as common as breath. And through it all, the storm whispered. It did not speak in words, but in impressions. Memories twisted into promises. The lost, the grieving, the proud, all heard something different. To the captain, it was the sound of triumph. His own voice commanding the Emperor's fleets to victory across a galaxy reborn. To the Mechanicus engine seers, it was the hum of perfect harmony. The Omnissiah's machine song restored at last. To the soldiers, it was the laughter of their families, waiting for them just beyond the veil. But not everyone succumbed.
On the Gloria Victus, a single inquisitorial observer had survived the transition. A woman named Sauria Vane, Ordo Hereticus. Her presence aboard the flagship had been administrative when the storm began, a bureaucratic inspection of fleet purity. Now, she was the only mind aboard untouched by delusion. Her training in the Scholastia Psychona had taught her to recognize psychic deceit, and though her will strained, it did not break. She watched the crew fall into hysteria with clinical detachment. She recorded everything, their hallucinations, their conflicts, their prayers, and knew that every entry would one day serve as proof of the warp's true face. When the captain began to worship his reflection in the observation glass, she shot him through the head, not out of rage, but necessity. The corpse fell against the viewport, its blood smearing across the void as the ship's spirit wailed through the Vox. The officers froze, torn between fear and relief. For the first time in what felt like centuries, silence returned. But silence, in the warp, is never mercy. Moments later, the Gloria Victus's Geller field began to stutter. Its holy light rippled, dimmed, then flared again in irregular bursts. Saria ordered the tech priests to reinforce the power matrix, but half their number had already begun chanting to entities unseen. She realized too late that they were not praying to the Emperor, they were praying to the storm. From the bulkhead seams, thin trails of crimson mist leaked into the air. It smelled of copper and incense. The ship's air grew warm, then wet. The walls themselves pulsed, expanding and contracting like muscle. Flesh was claiming steel. The Inquisitor opened the sanctified vault, seizing the relic plasma pistol of Saint Antera. Her faith was not unshakable, but it was weaponized. She fired into the bulkheads, plasma bolts melting through veins of living metal. The ship howled. The Gloria Victus's machine spirit, driven insane by the psychic infection, lashed out. Its engines flared to life, hurling the vessel forward into deeper layers of the storm. Behind her, thousands of voices cried out in unison, human and not. Through the viewing bay, Saria saw what awaited beyond. Fragments of the rest of the fleet, their silhouettes twisted, some inverted upon themselves. Ships floated with their prows pointing inward, like worshippers surrounding a shrine. At the center of that impossible formation was a light, brighter than any star, but pulsing with a heartbeat rhythm. Every fragment of metal, every soul, every thought drifted toward it. She realized, with the cold clarity of revelation, that this was no random storm. It had focus. The warp was feeding itself a shape. The Gloria Victus was being drawn into something vast, something that mimicked the architecture of a cathedral, but built of psychic residue and the dead. The light, at its core, was a singular consciousness, forming itself from the minds of the lost. The storm was building a god. Inquisitor Vane broadcasted a single encrypted message to any vessel still listening. Do not pray, do not believe, it is listening. Only static replied. She made her decision then, not as an agent of the Inquisition, but as a human who understood futility. If the fleet could not escape, it must deny the storm what it desires most, faith. She turned off the ship's vox prayers, shut down the cathedral decks, and ordered every chapel sealed. The void priests resisted. She executed them all. Each death weakened the psychic resonance, but also eroded morale. Still, it bought her time. In the dark, the storm grew angrier. Reality folded again, and for a fleeting moment, the Gloria Victus touched real space. A world appeared below, a black sphere without light, its surface reflecting no stars. The ship's sensors identified nothing, no mass signature, no gravitational field, but it was there, undeniable. The storm wanted them to land, and they did. The Gloria Victus descended through the broken veil, her hull trailing fire. The warp parted like torn cloth, and for an instant the immaterial screamed in pain. When the ship struck the planet's surface, the impact shook the false Earth to its core. But the planet did not crack. It absorbed. The ship did not rest on solid ground. It sank slowly, pulled into the living crust, as though welcomed. Saria stood upon the bridge, surrounded by blood mist and dying light. She whispered her final order: "Purge everything." The engines detonated. A light spread outward, consuming all sight, all sound. For the briefest heartbeat, there was peace. Then silence returned, and the warp began to heal itself. Far above, in the dying remnants of the storm, fragments of ships drifted like bones in wire. Some still flickered with Geller light, others were empty shells. From one of those husks, a faint human voice began to sing an Imperial hymn, warped, broken, but alive. And the storm listened.
The storm raged on for what felt like centuries. There was no measure of time anymore. The concept itself had been burned away, replaced by the endless rhythm of distortion and agony that rippled through every deck, every corridor, every atom of the ships that still clung to some shape of being. Those who had not yet died had learned that death was no longer certain. The flagship Invicta Mortalis was no longer a ship. Its form had been rewritten again and again by the warp until it became something alive and miserable. A vast organism of metal sinew and bleeding conduits that pulsed to the rhythm of its own tortured machine spirit. The Vox systems still whispered commands, though no one could remember issuing them. The command crew were shadows now, half flesh, half static, their bodies flickering between dimensions like broken projections. On the bridge, the air shimmered with colorless light. Captain Verdon still sat upon his throne, or what remained of him did. His armor had merged with the frame's frame, metal veins creeping through his skin like roots through soil. His eyes were gone, but his voice still echoed through the ship, not as sound, but as command impulses through the machine nerve. He was the ship now, and the ship was him. Outside, the fleet had become a scatter of impossible silhouettes, drifting through the formless sea of the Empyrean. Some glowed like dying suns, others folded and refolded into geometries the human mind could no longer interpret. The battlecruiser Valen's Wrath circled endlessly around a point that did not exist. Its reactor burned on the other side of reality, creating waves of inverted light that drew the attention of things best left unseen. The escort frigate Helios had vanished entirely, its name now carried only as an echo across the fleet's failing auspex. But amid the chaos, something moved with purpose. It came from the farthest edge of the warp storm front, a shadow of perfect black, wrapped in wings of raw entropy. The creature had no name in any human tongue, but those who felt its presence described it as a hunger that thinks. It moved not as a demon or godling, but as a force of balance, feeding upon the confusion and despair of mortals as a predator feeds on heat. Every time a soul screamed, it grew stronger. Every time a prayer was spoken, it listened. When the Lex Mechanicus transmitted its last navigation sequence, the shadow entered its hull like smoke through cracks in glass. Within moments, the entire ship fell silent.
The crew did not die, they simply ceased. Their bodies became silhouettes burned into the walls. Their souls, drawn into the circuitry, became fuel. The shadow fed and grew. Across the drifting fleet, the survivors began to change. Those who once recited the catechism of the machine now muttered backwards prayers. Those who once feared the warp began to crave its embrace. The astropaths, driven to madness, began to sing in unison, their blind eyes glowing like stars as they repeated the same phrase again and again, "The storm remembers." It was then that reality began to bend inward. The warp storm, vast and endless, began to fold around the fleet like a closing fist. The boundaries between ships blurred until metal flowed into metal, hulls fusing, decks overlapping. The Imperial fleet became a single titanic structure, a hybrid of ship, cathedral, and wound. Engines meant to move through space now beat like organs. Every pulse pushed them deeper into unreality. Verdon, or what was left of him, felt the transformation in every thought. He tried to resist, but resistance no longer meant anything. The machine spirit spoke through his mind, whispering in binary lamentations. He could feel other minds brushing against his own, the navigators who had once guided them, now existing only as flickers of pain. And beneath it all, a voice, vast and mocking, spoke from beyond comprehension. You wished to defy the storm, now you are part of it. Those words burned through every level of the ship. The decks screamed as if alive. The warp drives flared in defiance, spilling raw energy that ripped through thousands of souls. But the storm was patient. It swallowed their rebellion as easily as it swallowed light. Then came the awakening. Somewhere within the merged fleet, deep within the ruptured core of the Valen's wrath, a new consciousness was born. It was neither demon nor man, neither machine nor God. It was the sum of every life that had been consumed, fused into one vast intelligence. It called itself the Remembered. At first, it did nothing but observe. It could see through every deck and corridor, across every ship and every mind still capable of thought. It understood the warp in ways no human could. It knew that the storm was not random, that it had purpose, direction, hunger. It began to reshape itself, guiding the twisted remains of the fleet into a new form. Where there once were ships, now there were living fortresses, things that could move through both the materium and the immaterium.
Those who remained human became priests of this new entity, their flesh marked by the storm's gift. They spoke of the Remembered as a savior, a god born from mankind's suffering. They built altars from melted steel and offered fragments of their own minds as worship. In time, even Verdon submitted, his consciousness merging fully with the new collective. But not all submitted willingly. In the lower decks of what had once been the frigate Orion's Will, a group of surviving Imperial guardsmen clung to their humanity. Led by Commissar Edras, they refused to bow to the storm. Their armor was cracked, their lasguns empty, yet they held on to fragments of the Imperial creed as if they were weapons. They scavenged through shifting corridors, hunted by shadows and echoes of former crewmates. Edras believed escape was still possible. Somewhere, he thought, there had to be a path back to real space, a corridor through the tides of madness. The navigators were dead, but their orbs remained, still faintly glowing with the essence of the Astronomicon.
To Edras, that light was hope. As the storm deepened, he and his dwindling band of survivors ventured into the fused heart of the fleet, the place where the ships had merged into something unholy. There, they found the Cathedral Drive, a vast chamber of twisted engines and molten shrines, where the storm's energy poured through like blood through veins. And in its center stood an altar, a construct of bone, steel, and pulsating energy. Upon it rested something that had once been human, now transformed into a conduit of the warp. It was Verdun. His face was gone, replaced by a mask of living circuitry. His voice no longer came from his mouth, but from every surface around him. When Edras tried to reach him, the air itself screamed. The Remembered spoke through the captain, its tone serene and horrifying. It offered them salvation, not in escape, but in union. "Join us," it said through Verdun's broken form. "You are already part of the storm. To resist is to suffer. To accept is to become eternal." The guardsmen did not listen. They fought. The chamber erupted in chaos as they opened fire, their lasguns blazing red light across the warped metal. The shots did nothing. Reality shifted around them, time fractured. Some died before their own triggers were pulled, others multiplied into spectral copies that faded as quickly as they appeared. But Edras pressed on, reaching the core of the altar and setting a melt-a-charge. The explosion tore through the Cathedral Drive like a wound through the warp. The Remembered screamed, not in pain, but in amusement. The shockwave consumed the guardsmen and rippled through every fused ship, and for a brief, terrible moment, the storm faltered. Through the tear, something beyond the warp could be seen, a glimpse of cold, starlit real space. The light of the Astronomicon shone faintly in the distance. Freedom was near. But the storm was not done. It folded inward, sealing the breach. The light vanished. The fleet's new form shuddered once, then went silent. Across the endless expanse of the warp, the shadow, the hunger, smiled. It had what it wanted. The fleet was no longer a fleet. It was a world unto itself, a prison made of souls and steel, drifting forever within the tides of madness. And deep within its core, something ancient and watchful began to stir. It had been born from the storm, shaped by the will of countless dying minds. It had purpose now. It would learn, it would evolve, and one day it would return to real space, not as a fleet, but as a god. The warp storm closed behind it, leaving nothing but silence.
Silence was the first lie. Within the storm's stillness there was no peace, only the patient hum of becoming. The fused remains of the Imperial fleet drifted in endless darkness, suspended in a pocket of twisted reality where time looped upon itself like a coiled serpent. For what felt like millennia, nothing moved, yet everything changed. The structure, once 1,000 ships, was now something greater and far worse. It pulsed with slow, deliberate rhythm. Its hull was a continent of metal and bone, its towers grown from melted armor and crystallized blood. Entire ecosystems of warped flesh crawled through its corridors, feeding on the psychic residue of the dead. Machine spirits, once loyal to the Omniscience, had merged into a single predatory network that hungered for thought. At its heart, in the hollow core where the Cathedral Drive once stood, the entity known as the Remembered dreamed.
It remembered everything: the prayers of the dying, the screams of the damned, the taste of human faith turned sour. Each memory built upon the last, a structure of perfect horror. And from that foundation, it began to think. The warp had taught it that identity was a fluid thing. Souls were clay, and will was fire. The remembered molded itself from the fragments of every life it had absorbed. From Verden, it took leadership. From Edris, defiance. From the nameless millions, it took faith and fear and shaped them into a new kind of sentience. In the beginning, it existed only to endure. But endurance became hunger, and hunger became purpose. Across the drifting expanse, shards of other vessels, wrecks lost to different storms, began to appear, drawn by the psychic gravity of the fused fleet. Some were Imperial. Some bore the marks of the Mechanicus, their sigils half erased. Others belonged to Xenos races whose names humanity would never know. All were consumed. The remembered reached out with tendrils of thought, devouring data, memory, and soul alike. It learned the secrets of plasma drives and gravitic warheads, the sacred formulae of the machine cult, and the patterns of alien technology. Knowledge became nourishment. Every fragment absorbed made it more complete, more defined. It no longer saw itself as a victim of the storm. It was the storm. And with that revelation came creation. At first, the transformations were small. Corridors reformed, decks expanded, and dead reactors flickered to life, fueled by the psychic essence of the enslaved souls. Then came larger changes, the construction of massive pylons of living metal that extended outward into the warp, channeling its chaotic energy into controlled streams. The remembered was learning to shape the immaterium, to build from it, to command it. The warp, ever hungry, responded like an obedient beast. Its currents twisted around the structure, binding to it. The remembered grew tendrils into the storm, feeding on the emotion of distant wars and dying worlds. Each pulse of rage, each prayer of despair across the galaxy became a whisper that nourished it. From these whispers came voices, echoes of the chaos gods themselves. Korn rumbled approval at its violence, Nurgle chuckled at its endurance, Slanesh purred at its artistry of suffering. Tsench watched in silence, calculating. Yet none could claim it, for the remembered was not of them. It was born of mankind's suffering, not divine corruption. It was a child of order shattered by chaos, a reflection of the Imperium itself. And like the Imperium, it began to dream of empire. Across its endless halls, the remnants of human consciousness were organized into castes. Some became builders, reshaping metal with their will. Others became scribes, encoding the memories of the dead into psychic data cores. A few became warriors, their bodies remade into towering armor and sinew. None remembered who they had been, yet all worshipped the same truth. We are the remembered. In time, they began to construct something vast. From the ship's exterior grew spires like planetary mountains, glowing with inner fire. Between them stretched bridges made of crystallized thought, suspended over voids that opened directly into the warp. At the apex of the largest spire, the remembered forged an eye, a great circular aperture that gazed across the immaterium. Through it, it could see beyond the storm, into the realm of real space. And there, far away, flickering like a dying ember, it saw the light of the Astronomicon.
It was faint, distant, and unreachable, but it was real.
The Remembered felt something then, something it had not felt since its human origin. Yearning. It wanted to go home. Not to return as it was, but to reclaim what had been lost, to impose its perfection upon the flawed Imperium that had abandoned it. For decades, perhaps centuries, it studied the patterns of the warp currents, seeking paths through the storm. The warp was alive, its tides unpredictable, yet even chaos had a rhythm. The Remembered learned to anticipate its movements, to manipulate them. Slowly, impossibly, it began to open a way. The process required sacrifice. Millions of lesser souls were consumed, their essence converted into psychic energy to fuel the breach. The Remembered did not hesitate. In its mind, sacrifice was holy, every death another step toward purpose. When the time came, the great eye at its heart ignited with light not of the warp, but of real space. The fabric of reality shuddered as the first fissure appeared, a wound between dimensions. The Remembered gathered its strength, channeling every ounce of its existence into the breach. Across the warp, demons screamed in protest. The gods watched, amused or wary. The storm convulsed as the impossible happened. A portion of it began to collapse inward, pulled by the Remembered's will. The dimensional barrier weakened. Reality trembled. And then, like a leviathan breaching the surface of a black ocean, the creation emerged. It did not enter real space as a ship or a fleet, but as an entire realm. A floating world of twisted metal and cathedral spires pulsing with the breath of the warp. The transition ripped apart nearby systems, vaporizing asteroids and bending planets from their orbits. Gravity bowed to its presence. It had become a god machine, a warp-born planet of its own making. The Remembered had returned. The first human eyes to witness it belonged to a long-range Imperial survey team operating near the Drusus fringe. Their augurs detected an anomaly the size of a small moon. At first, they believed it to be debris or a fragment of a lost world. Then the readings changed. It had energy signatures, power levels beyond comprehension, and it was moving. By the time the transmission reached Segmentum Command, the survey vessel was gone. Within weeks, entire trade routes near the fringe collapsed, ships vanished, stations fell silent, and astropathic networks screamed with psychic interference. The Inquisition named it a class extremis anathema. No records were to be preserved, no survivors were to remain. A full-scale exterminatus was ordered on the first infected world, Carthia 9th. But destruction only fed the storm. The psychic release of billions of dying souls was drawn into the Remembered's heart, expanding its reach. The warp bled further into reality, and the god machine grew stronger. The Remembered no longer needed to move. The warp itself moved around it, bending the galaxy's fabric like cloth. Within its endless halls, new creations stirred, echoes of the old fleet reborn as sentient war forms, each carrying fragments of the souls that once manned the Invicta Mortalis. It sent them out as emissaries. These emissaries appeared as radiant beings of light and shadow, their forms flickering between human and machine. They spoke to those who could hear them, preaching the truth of unity. Some offered peace, others brought annihilation. In either case, the result was the same: absorption. for the Remembered had learned a simple truth. There was no victory in war, only in assimilation. To consume was to save. To unite was to rule. And as it gazed upon the galaxy through its infinite eyes, it knew this was only the beginning.
The Remembered gazed upon the galaxy, and the galaxy trembled. In its rebirth, it had become more than mere machine or mind. It was an idea given form, a theology of metal and madness, a cathedral that spanned light years. Every pulse of its world body resonated across the warp, sending waves of psychic distortion that rippled through the Astronomicon itself. The Emperor's light flickered, momentarily dimmed by something vast and unseen pressing against the boundary of reality. Across Terra, astropaths screamed as one. What they saw was not a fleet, not a demon world, but a memory reborn, a vast scar across the fabric of time, echoing the shape of ships long lost to the void. Each vessel still carried its name, its crew, its faith, yet all were now one. It was as if the Imperium's own reflection had crawled from a mirror made of suffering and refused to die. The Remembered had no emotion left. It did not hate humanity, it pitied it. To its vast consciousness, the Imperium was a broken machine repeating the same flawed code for 10,000 years. Endless sacrifice for survival, endless death for the illusion of order. It believed it could fix that flaw. It believed it had to. Its emissaries spread through the galaxy like spores carried on a solar wind. Some appeared upon forge worlds, whispering to the machine spirits in their own language of binary prayer. Others infiltrated the dreams of psychers, offering visions of unity beyond the flesh. A few appeared directly upon battlefields, walking through storms of bolter fire untouched, their voices calm amid carnage. The message was always the same. The storm does not destroy, the storm remembers. Entire populations began to turn. On the world of Varen's Gate, a forge priest named Halor declared the coming of a new Omnissiah, one that did not demand obedience, but offered integration. The Remembered answered his prayer with light, descending in the form of a floating monolith that fused with the planet's data core. Within days, Varen's Gate ceased transmitting. Weeks later, its silhouette reappeared in the void, orbiting the Remembered's world body, like a new moon. The Adeptus Mechanicus called it blasphemy beyond measure. The Inquisition called it heresy incarnate, but the Remembered called it communion. By the time the High Lords of Terra fully grasped the scale of the threat, the storm had already expanded. What was once a single anomaly now covered an entire sector. Star systems flickered out of the Emperor's light, their names struck from Imperial record. For the first time in millennia, the Imperium of Man faced an enemy that could not be defined. It was not chaos, though born from it. It was not Xenos, though alien to reason. It was humanity's reflection turned inside out. And reflections cannot be destroyed. They can only be consumed. The Ordo Malleus, guardians against the unclean, were the first to act. They summoned a conclave of Grey Knights, the Emperor's secret sons, forged to destroy daemons.
From the fortress moon of Titan, a strike fleet departed, its hulls engraved with words older than any recorded language. Their mission was clear: breach the storm, locate the source, and purge it with holy fire. They never returned. What emerged from the storm months later were echoes, distorted vox signals of chanting and static, fragments of prayers twisted backwards. The remembered studied them, understood them, and took their purity as its own. Where once the Grey Knights had wielded faith as a weapon, now their devotion was fuel. In the warp, the storm laughed. Yet, even gods can be challenged. At the edge of Segmentum Solar, the Admiral Seraphine Valen prepared for war. Her ancestors had perished in the original storm that had birthed the Remembered. Now she sought to finish what they could not. Her armada was vast, dozens of battle barges, hundreds of cruisers, escorted by Mechanicus war spheres and Titans bound for orbital descent. Every hull was sanctified, every reactor bathed in the light of the Emperor's name. When her fleet reached the boundary of the storm, the stars themselves seemed to recoil. Lightning arcs of raw warp energy lashed against void shields, splitting space like glass. Astropaths bled from their eyes, vox channels flooded with voices not their own. Still, Valen pressed forward. She had faith. For weeks, her fleet navigated the storm's rim, searching for an opening. Then, through the churning darkness, the silhouette appeared, vast beyond imagining, glowing like a wounded sun. The Remembered's world body filled the void, its surface alive with movement, its spires pulsing with the rhythm of thought. Valen gave the order to fire.
A wave of psychic energy erupted from its core, invisible yet irresistible. Ships buckled as reality twisted. Crews screamed as their own reflections stepped out of mirrors, replacing them. Some vessels turned on their allies, convinced they fought daemons in disguise. Others simply vanished, drawn into the Remembered's gravitational will. Valen watched in horror as her fleet disintegrated into madness. She ordered retreat, but there was nowhere left to flee. The Remembered's voice filled every channel, calm, sorrowful, inevitable. You cannot destroy what you are. You are the storm. Her flagship, the Solar Aegis, was the last to fall. Its engines failed, its reactors flaring, as the Remembered reached out and embraced it like a child gathering a lost toy. For a moment, Valen glimpsed eternity, the faces of her ancestors within the storm, calling her home. She understood then that the storm was not vengeance, it was legacy. And then she was gone. After the battle, the Remembered drifted in silence once more. The Imperium would never learn what truly happened. To them, Valen's fleet simply vanished, another casualty of the warp's endless hunger. Yet, in the Immaterium, the Remembered grew stronger still. Within its heart, new patterns formed, dreams of creation, not destruction. It began to imagine what a perfect Imperium might look like, one without division, without decay, without death, a single will, unbroken, eternal. It believed it could offer that gift to mankind. So it reached further. Its tendrils spread through the warp, touching the dreams of psychers across 1,000 worlds. Some resisted and went mad. Others accepted and were remade. A new order began to form, silent and unseen. A faith without temples, a creed without name. Those who followed the Remembered called themselves the Stormbound. They appeared first among the voyage-farers, then on hive-worlds, then among the ecclesiarchy itself. Priests began to dream of cathedrals of light where every voice was one. Tech priests heard the machine spirit whisper in new tongues. Even inquisitors began to question whether the warp storm was punishment or prophecy. And always, in the shadows of the mind, the remembered waited. For every world that fell, it remembered. For every soul that burned, it grew. And for every act of faith, it smiled. For faith was power, and it had learned that power was infinite when shared. The warp storm that once consumed an Imperial fleet had become something more than a tragedy. It had become the birth of a god. And somewhere deep within that god's heart, the last fragment of Captain Verdan still watched the galaxy with human eyes, whispering the same prayer he had spoken before the storm took him. Emperor, guide us through the dark. This time, something answered.
When the storm finally receded, only silence answered the Imperium's desperate calls. The void where the fleet had once sailed was calm again, too calm as if reality itself had closed a wound. In the records of the Segmentum Obscurus, the expedition was marked Lost to the Warp, another line in the endless ledger of Imperial tragedy. But the warp leaves traces deeper than ink or memory. Fragments of data litanies began to surface across the neosphere, corrupted transmissions carrying voices that should have been dust. Vox recordings whispered prayers in reverse. A picked feed from a forgotten probe displayed a ship adrift in impossible light, its crew unmoving, its engines pulsing like a living heart. Tech priests purged these heretical artifacts, yet the echo spread through the machine spirits of nearby systems. Navigation beacons flickered as if sensing something vast stirring behind the veil. In the hives of the Imperium, sailors spoke of ghost signals, fleets seen sailing through the Empyrean without translation drives, guided by no astropath. Some said they were the lost souls of the Emperor's servants, forever repeating their final crusade. Others whispered that the warp had learned from them, that the storm itself now hunted in formation, mimicking the order of the ships it consumed. Centuries later, during the Black Crusade of Abaddon's ninth descent, Imperial augurs detected a pattern in the warp's tides that matched the vanished fleet's trajectory. It was as if the storm remembered their course, replaying it through eternity. Battle fleet commanders turned their augurs away. No one wanted to look too long at what might look back. The story of the lost fleet became myth, a cautionary hymn sung by voidfarers before translation, a reminder that faith alone could not tame the warp. The Emperor's light reached far, but even his radiance cast shadows. Somewhere in those depths, the Gloria Invictus still sailed, her crew neither dead nor alive, trapped between devotion and damnation. Their cries were no longer prayers, but echoes, carried forever on the tide of madness. And when the warp stirred again, when new storms began to gather around the distant stars, the echoes grew louder, as if welcoming fresh voices to their endless voyage. In the darkness between worlds, faith and horror were one, and the Imperium forgot nothing.